520s. That's the market value of a disappointment. My father didn't look up as he flicked the crisp bills across his mahogany desk. They slid over the polished surface, coming to rest near the edge of my world. Consider it your final dividend, Julian. Since you've chosen to be a glorified repairman instead of a partner, you're officially off the ledger. I stood in the center of the Sterling Estate's great hall, my single duffel bag feeling heavier than the degree I had received 3 days prior, a ceremony my parents had deemed not worth the commute. Around us, 3 centuries of banking history stared down from oil paintings, their eyes judging my simple denim jacket and the radical ideas inside my head. I'm an engineer, Dad. I build things. I don't just move numbers around to hide the rot. He laughed, a dry, what a hollow sound that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. You build nothing. Without the sterling name, you're a ghost in a machine. I didn't argue. I simply picked up the $100, tucked it into my pocket, and checked my watch. Before the next chapter, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below letting me know which city you're tuning in from and the exact time it is there right now. Your support is the engine that keeps these stories moving, and I love seeing our global community grow. My mother leaned against the limestone archway, a gin and tonic held loosely in her hand, despite it being barely past noon. She didn't look angry. She looked bored, as if my disinheritance was a minor clerical error that was ruining her lunch plans. Julian, don't be tedious, she sighed, and her voice trailing off as she adjusted a heavy gold Cartier necklace. It was a piece she wore like armor, another trophy collected in a life measured by social prestige and country club rankings. Your father is just stressed about the board meeting. Apologize for the engineering nonsense, put on a suit, and we can all pretend this afternoon never happened. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the practiced, glassy smile that served as her only mask. To her, I wasn't a son with a vision. I was a piece of the sterling brand that was currently out of alignment. I'm not pretending anymore, Mother. I'd rather be a repairman with a soul than a partner who's already dead inside. She just took a slow sip of her drink, her eyes already drifting back to her reflection in the hallway mirror. I was already a ghost to her. For 4 generations, the name Sterling was synonymous with safe harbor. Sterling and Croft Wealth Management didn't just handle money, they curated legacies. My ancestors had survived the Great Depression, the dot-com bubble, and the 2008 crash by adhering to a singular philosophy: never invest in anything you can't see from a mahogany boardroom window. Then came me. Applied physics? My father had bellowed when I declared my concentration. You want to spend your life in a grease-stained lab coat, Julian? That's for people who work with their hands because they aren't smart enough to work with their minds. Engineers are just blue-collar laborers with fancy pens. A Sterling manages the men who build things. He doesn't build them himself. He couldn't see the shift. While he was obsessed with compound interest and legacy portfolios, I was looking at the crumbling state of global infrastructure. He saw garage startups as a hobby for the restless. I saw them as the new cathedrals of industry. I knew that the next trillion-dollar empire wouldn't be built on a ledger of debt, but on a breakthrough in physical reality. My father was chasing the ghosts of the old economy, while I was hunting for the spark that would power the new one. He called me delusional for wanting to tinker with energy storage. I called him stagnant for thinking the world would always run on his terms. The divide wasn't just about a degree. It was about 2 different centuries colliding in one living room. Most people in my position would have buckled. The Sterling legacy wasn't just a name, it was a set of high-tensile golden handcuffs. And to walk away meant forfeiting a life where every door was pre-opened and every failure was cushioned by a trust fund. My father bankrolled my silence because he knew that in the world of high finance, a man without a pedigree is invisible. But I had realized something he hadn't. Those handcuffs were getting tighter. If I stayed, I wouldn't be Julian Sterling. I would be a polished mirror reflecting my father's ego until I eventually cracked. The psychological cost of staying, the slow erosion of my own curiosity, was far higher than the risk of being broke. I didn't leave because I was angry. I left because I was hungry for a reality that wasn't curated by an estate lawyer. I understood that true power isn't inheriting an empire, it's having the internal architecture to build one from the dirt up. While my father saw a son losing his mind, I saw a man finally finding his spine. The bronze-plated security doors hissed shut behind me with a finality that felt like a guillotine. As I stood on the sidewalk, the silence of the suburbs felt deafening. I reached for my car keys, then stopped. The Mercedes was registered to Sterling and Croft. My luxury apartment in the city? A perk of the trust fund I had just surrendered. I was 23 years old, and for the first time in my life, I didn't own the ground I stood on. I walked 3 miles to the Greyhound station, the wheels of my duffel bag rattling against the pavement. I spent $55 on a one-way ticket to Palo Alto and another $8 on a black coffee and a dry donut in a neon-lit diner. Sitting in a vinyl booth, I opened my engineering journal and drafted my new articles of incorporation. Not for a company, but for my life. Zero leverage. I would never use a Sterling connection to open a door. Technical primacy. My value would come from what I could solve, not who I knew. Total acquisition. When I returned, I wouldn't be asking for a seat at their table. I'd be buying the building. With exactly $37 left in my pocket and a laptop full of impossible physics, I boarded the bus. As the lights of my hometown blurred into the dark, I felt a strange, terrifying lightness. I was finally worth nothing, which meant I was finally free to become anything. Palo Alto didn't care about my pedigree. My first 3 nights were spent in a 24-hour laundromat, using the hum of the industrial dryers to drown out the reality that I was down to my last $12. My office was a corner table at a tech-focused co-working space where the night manager, Elena, turned a blind eye to the fact that I wasn't a paying member. "You're the guy who's been living on free water and dry crackers for a week," Elena said one night, hovering over my laptop. I was deep into a schematic for a solid-state electrolyte thermal system. Before she could kick me out, I gestured to the industrial 3D printer in the corner that had been marked out of order for months. "Your extruder is misaligned and the firmware is looping. Give me an hour with it, and let me sleep in the break room tonight." I had it running in 40 minutes. Elena was more than impressed. She was resourceful. She offered me a job as the on-call technician for the space. Suddenly, I had a key, a couch, and more importantly, a high-speed connection to the research databases I needed. While the visionaries in the front office were pitching apps for dog walking, I spent my nights at the back desk dismantling the laws of physics. Elena would watch my screen, fascinated by the cascading thermal models. "So, you're making a battery that doesn't explode?" she asked. "I'm making a battery that doesn't leak," I corrected. "Current storage loses 20% of its load just sitting still. My design uses a synthetic crystal lattice to lock energy in place with near-zero degradation. It's physically impossible according to the textbooks." I grinned at her, the exhaustion vanishing behind the data. Good thing I stopped reading those textbooks. By month 4, I had saved enough from freelance repair work to rent a literal closet in a house full of coders. It was 4 square feet of freedom where I began building the first miniature prototype. The breakthrough didn't come with a shout. It came with a terrifying silence. At 3:14 a.m., in a rented corner of a university materials lab, the sensors on my prototype stabilized. The energy discharge was flat. The reading showed 99.4% retention over a 72-hour cycle. In the world of energy, that wasn't just an improvement, it was a miracle. It meant that wind and solar power were no longer intermittent hobbies. They were now more reliable than coal. My mentor, Marcus Thorne, a veteran hardware architect I'd met through a freelance gig, brought in Dr. Eris Thorne to verify the data. She spent 12 hours trying to find a calibration error. When she finally looked up, her hands were shaking. Julian, you didn't just build a better battery. You've solved the storage paradox. With her endorsement, I secured a meeting with Vance Capital Partners. The first two firms I visited laughed me out of the room, calling the tech theoretical fantasy for someone without a PhD. But Elias Vance, a man known for betting on impossible infrastructure, looked past my lack of credentials. The Sterling name is all over the financial news today, Julian, Elias said, leaning back in his chair. But your name isn't on any of their ledgers. Why? Because a Sterling manages other people's money, I replied, my voice cold and steady. I'm here because I own the solution to the world's biggest problem. You aren't investing in a name. You're investing in the physics. He studied the 99.4% efficiency report for a long minute, 5 million for 20%. And I want a seat on the board. I didn't blink. 22%, and you get the seat. But I retain all intellectual property rights for the next generation of the lattice. We shook hands. I named the company Zenith Infrastructure Systems. It was a nod to the highest point, the place my father thought I'd never reach. 2 years later, we moved from a closet to a 50,000 square foot manufacturing plant. Zenith wasn't just a startup anymore. It was the new backbone of the grid. Every major utility provider in the country was suddenly beating down our door. While Zenith was scaling, Sterling and Croft was bleeding. Over the last 6 years, the world had moved on, but my father's firm had remained a monument to the 20th century. They were heavily leveraged in fossil fuels and retail real estate, sectors my technology was actively dismantling. I monitored their quarterly reports like a surgeon watching a failing pulse. They were desperate, looking for a white knight to save them from a series of bad bets and a looming hostile takeover. What they didn't realize was that the predatory firms circling them, Meridian Equity Partners, didn't exist in the traditional sense. It was a tactical acquisition vehicle I had built using Zenith's massive cash reserves. I had spent 18 months quietly buying up Sterling and Croft's distressed debt and accumulating a voting bloc through a dozen different proxies. Is it time? Elena, now my chief operating officer, asked as she handed me a folder detailing their final collapse. Not yet, I said, looking at the invitation to their emergency shareholder meeting. I want to be there when the ledger finally balances. I wasn't going back to settle a childhood grudge. I was going back because Sterling and Croft was a dying engine, and I was the only one who knew how to rebuild it. My father had taught me that money was the only measure of worth. It was time to show him the true cost of his own obsolescence. The boardroom of Sterling and Croft felt like a tomb. A massive brass clock sat on the mantel, its pendulum stilled, a fitting metaphor for the company's momentum. My father sat at the head of the table, his shoulders hunched, his eyes fixed on the acquisition papers from Meridian Equity. He looked like a man trying to outrun a shadow. "We are prepared to discuss the buyout terms," my father said, his voice raspy, not even glancing at me as I sat at the opposite end. "But we demand the Sterling name remains on the masthead. The name is the first thing I'm removing," I said. The room went cold. My father's head snapped up. He squinted, his brain struggling to reconcile the billionaire tech CEO in the custom charcoal suit with the disappointment he'd exiled 6 years ago. "Julian?" he whispered. The name sounded like a confession. "Hello, Arthur," I replied, sliding a leather-bound folder across the table. "I believe you were looking for a white knight. Unfortunately, you got me instead." The board members began whispering frantically as they opened the folders. I didn't wait for them to catch up. Meridian Equity isn't a competitor. It's a secondary arm of Zenith Infrastructure. As of 9 o'clock this morning, I hold 48.2% of your outstanding shares. More importantly, I've purchased 100% of your senior secured debt. In layman's terms, I don't just own your office, I own the air you're breathing. My father's face drained of color, turning a sickly shade of gray. You. You used your success to destroy your own blood? I used my success to save the employees you were about to bankrupt with your pride, I countered. You told me money was the only measure of a man's worth, Dad. I'm just playing by your rules, by your own metric. I'm the only person in this room whose opinion matters. I stood up, leaning over the table. The offer is non-negotiable. You resign today. The Sterling and Croft name is retired and replaced by Zenith Financial Services. You get a comfortable retirement and the firm gets a future. If you refuse, I call in the debt by noon tomorrow, and this entire building becomes a parking lot for my engineers. He looked at the folder, then at me. For the first time, I didn't see the man I feared. I saw a small, outdated piece of hardware that had finally been superseded. The restructuring took 8 months of relentless technical and cultural surgery. We didn't just change the letterhead, we gutted the internal rot. I turned the mahogany-heavy executive floor into an open-plan innovation hub, replacing the smell of expensive cigars with the hum of servers and the energy of engineers who were building actual infrastructure. Most of the staff stayed, relieved to finally be part of a company that looked forward instead of over its shoulder. My father retreated to the Sterling estate, a man buried alive in his own legacy. I made sure he was financially secure, not out of love, but because I refused to let his bankruptcy be a stain on my brand. My mother's calls became more frequent, always hinting at family dinners and healing the rift, but her voice still carried that practiced, hollow social tone. I never answered. Some bridges aren't meant to be rebuilt. They are meant to be left as ruins to remind you of where you started. I wasn't the boy who left with $100 anymore, and I didn't need a seat at a table that was only set with ghosts. A year after the takeover, I returned to the co-working space where Elena had once let a starving engineer sleep in the break room. It was a sleek tech hub now, partially funded by Zenith. I sat at the same back table, drinking a coffee I could finally afford without checking my balance. Before leaving, I pulled 5 crisp $20 bills from my wallet, the exact amount my father had used to dismiss me, and left them on the counter as a tip for the next dreamer working through the night. My father was right about one thing: money is a measure. But he was wrong about the scale. Where it doesn't measure who you are, it measures the distance you're willing to travel to prove the world wrong. Those 5 bills didn't buy me a career. They bought me the freedom to stop being a Sterling so I could finally become Julian. I didn't build an empire for revenge. I built it because the only way to fix a broken system is to become the one who powers the new one. If you've ever had to choose your own path when everyone else was telling you to stay in line, hit that like button. Have you ever been told your dreams were worthless? Tell me your story in the comments. And if you're ready to see more stories about building something out of nothing, make sure to subscribe. Our community is growing, and your voice matters here.